So we're just going to start with a bit of news, but just to set the scene, deep in the opulence of the Cotswolds, an evil lurks, affecting everyday life, an evil known as potholes. And that's a bit like cybersecurity. If you fill in the holes, you'll get a smoother ride. So we're going to start off with our news from the potholes section, talk a little bit about attack surface visibility, and then attack surface management, and then Shaq's going to give us a walkthrough of what a kind of kill chain or attack map might look like from a kind of hacker's perspective, you know, the activities and exploits that they go through. So moving swiftly on, let's get going with our news.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Michael. I do like that. I was wondering what the starred out word was. It's potholes.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I should have had an animation, I think. So yeah, thanks. So first bit of news from the potholes. Data breach hits 165 businesses and counting. Big names such as Ticketmaster and Santander have been impacted. And this is according to Google Mandiant. So all customers affected appear to be using the data warehousing platform Snowflake. And the root cause of this, and you might have heard a lot about this story over the last month because there's more information rippling out, but the root cause appears to be credentials that were aggregated from various spyware campaigns and being sold on the dark web. And also, I think a contractor was infected with InfoStealer malware, and that the bulk of the credentials came from that, and they were working with the data. But yeah, it's in flight. There's stories, I think, from Wired magazine this week on that, and various security podcasts. So I think, for me, in summary, for this issue, there's real credentials that have been used to access the data, but the failure of securing those credentials with extra factors of authentication, with MFA and access control measures, and things like password rotation, that's left the data wide open. So these attacks have been attributed to a group named UNC 5537. I wasn't familiar with that before this webinar, and just my thoughts on this, and I'll defer to yourself, Shaq, as well. I think, you know, we're seeing poor cyber hygiene and kind of even visibility, that you've lost credentials, that there's stuff out there being sold that gives access to kind of your platform. So I suppose that's maybe aimed at Snowflake as a vendor. They would be able to say, well, the customers should have had these defaults. But I think if you've got secure defaults in the platform, like the MFA enforcement, that would have stopped, you know, the seriousness of this issue. But yeah, any thoughts on that and the old weak credentials and cyber hygiene arguments there?
Yeah, I think I'll start with, you know, this story is really interesting, and it's just blowing up more and more. And some of the puns I've heard is like, you know, it's snowballing, as it were, right? The Snowflake story. It's crazy that, you know, Ticketmaster and others have got over, you know, 500 million records, accounts, details that are now compromised as a result of using this platform. And you mentioned, you know, perhaps one of the employees or somebody's or a contractor whose credentials were compromised at some point. According to Snowflake, that was a demo environment, a demo account. They're denying that, you know, there was any kind of vulnerability or security issue on their side. It appears that a lot of these credentials were stolen through an info stealer, right? Trojan malware, Redline, and things like that. We've seen other info stealers are quite stealthy, sitting in the background and stealing all sorts of interesting data. If they can target certain people, it means, you know, they've essentially been able to take your username, passwords, things like cookie session, browsing history, all those kind of things. So it's a bit weird, I would say, that all of these, you know, 165 out of their 9,000 customers have been targeted, and their credentials have been stolen, all relating to Snowflake, right? Surely, you know, they might have other stuff as well. It seems like at the moment that it is probably just malware and credential stealers that have unfortunately targeted this particular platform because of the fact that they haven't enforced MFA. And so it you know, it goes back to that, the whole sort of MFA, multi-factor authentication, They're now saying that you should turn it on. They're still not enforcing it, but it should be turned on if you're using it, especially with a privileged account. And I think probably the same applies for everywhere else, right? We always recommend turning on MFA for
Yeah,
important
it's the
accounts.
secure defaults. I mean, credit card companies have been doing this for years, haven't they? You get your credit card, then you get a separate PIN. It's not the most secure, but it's still, you've got something you have, and then something right? So you got two factors in effect. But everyone's used to that. So it's it's crazy that this is still ongoing. But I suppose with the adoption of the cloud and just trying to make it easy to use, maybe that's where it all came from. But it feels like SaaS sort of by the back door. So your storage, your data warehouse, the service that Snowflake's offering, and it's down to people who are using that to make sure it's secured, right? But then a secure default of enforcing MFA would make the difference. All right, so I think we've done that one, but that's still in flight. I think we're going to see more on this. And
I think so. I think it's going to keep blowing up. I think that there's a lot more to come out. I think there's a lot more that we don't know as to how far this goes. Because if you think about Snowflake as a platform, right, from a data warehousing perspective, it seems that some of the organizations have been storing a lot of important data there. Obviously aggregating it and doing all of the sort of work around whatever they need to do from an analysis point. Really powerful platform, by the way, really good. It's just now, it's all detracted with this whole issue. So I think, there's definitely a lot more to find out in the coming days. See what's behind it, really.
Fantastic, thanks, Shaq. Okay, let's move on to our next story. Okay, so news from the potholes too. So ransomware cyber attack hits pathology services. So this is ongoing as well. I think we're still in flight here. So hospitals in London had to cancel services and surgeries following a supply chain attack on the UK healthcare provider Synovis. And this has actually impacted services in the affected hospitals where they've had to sort of go back to almost paper to prioritize urgent work. Now, I think this is, in terms of a real world outcome, we've heard of attacks, things like Colonial Pipeline in the past, people queuing to get their fuel and stuff way back, I think it's 2021. But, right now, I remember after seeing this attack on the news, they were, NHS were asking for like more blood donors, and it's because because of the attack, they're not able to match blood types, right, for transfusions now. So they're appealing for the kind of type O negative, the angel blood to so it matches anyone, right? And blood only has a shelf life of 35 days. So this is a real world impact where operations and people's health and well-being is being impacted because of a cyber attack. So that's really alarming. It's a shame, it's a shame that this is the world we live in, where it's kind of healthcare and education, and we keep seeing these attacks hitting the kind of public services and stuff that's supposed to be looking after us. But it just shows how unscrupulous the attackers are. So this has been attributed to the Russian group of criminals known as Qlin, according to a former National Cyber Centre security staff member. And I think for me, it made me think of just ensuring the supply chain is secure, making sure your incident response is top notch to that. But it looks like the hospitals are still working, right? They're still doing something, but they've just been impacted and patients have been impacted. Have you got any thoughts on that, Shaq?
Yeah, I think ransomware's kind of here to stay, and just as we had the other sort of news item, which was slightly different. It wasn't necessarily ransomware related, a different angle around credentials and that sort of initial sort of reconnaissance piece. But yeah, it's a shame, right? There are some threat actors that won't target things like health services, and there are others that don't care, right? And for them, everything's a target. So I think this will trigger a response, from the cyber security community, just to sort of like share intel around the threat actors, and like we've seen with Lockbit and others. I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of being able to sort of locate some of these people behind it. But it's it's disruptive. It affects real lives, affects people. So it's just hopefully they can they can recover quite quickly from it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the lockbit you mentioned, I think they sort of publish who was behind that. They revealed the identity. I think that was unprecedented. I think it was the FBI. I think maybe recently I heard that. And they actually they doxed him. They put out his address, I think, or something. But yeah, so I think you're going to see the sort of release of the hounds, I suppose, as they would say on that Risky Biz podcast, or on The Simpsons. But I think you're going to see, the authorities going after these kind of groups. But we're going to see more of this hitting our critical infrastructure. And yeah, it's just, I mean, it keeps us in work, right? Ransomware keeps us in work, keeps us all in a job in cybersecurity. But it's just that it's such a shame that it hits services like this all the time. So, okay, moving on. What can we do about all this? Okay, let's move on. So I just wanted to talk about, okay, so attack surface, how do you define it? And it's just to say, well, if you know your assets and what's critical, there's various techniques to understand, where you're vulnerable and what does that mean in context of your business. And I'm building up here to Shak's World and Pentera and our CISSP partnership with Pentera. In terms of, if you can take things like vulnerability assessment, breach and attack simulation, penetration testing, all of those things are great to try and learn about your attack surface, but they're hard to do manually, right? So a bit of automation, if you can automate these functions, they're going to become foundational, critical to your planning, your roadmap, and also doing your homework in terms of knowing what your security controls are doing and how effective they are, and ultimately what your kind of risk profile looks like. So, and I'll just move on to the next slide, and then we can hear more from Shak. So in terms of that visibility, I've just touched on that with those methodologies. Now, if to manage it, your attack surface, you need to do the discovery, the test, and the remediation. But the point is that is iterative, right? It doesn't go away. So you end up with a program of governance. So when you're doing a yearly pen test, that's well and good. You get a list of to-dos and you're doing that for compliance reasons. But that's not enough, because your business is changing all the time. If you think about other businesses buying other businesses, mergers and acquisitions, there's so many use cases. There's so much going on. It could be new systems being deployed, but there's always change in infrastructure, right? So this means you need to validate your security. You need to test more often and know your weaknesses, know your attack surface, and just have that kind of risk indicator of your security posture. So I'm using a bit of cybersec language there, with a bit of vendor speak, but I think with that, that's probably enough from me. And let's move on and hear from Shak about the wonderful things Pentera can do to help with this challenge.
So the idea is, with the attack, you're absolutely right. We talk about continuous threat exposure. So that's Gartner terminology around trying to sort of extrapolate what the attack surface looks like from an attacker's perspective. For us, we're interested in things that an attacker would leverage, right? Like an open port, let's say infrastructure, that like an outdated firewall, outdated applications or systems that have some sort of vulnerability that allows an attacker essentially a foothold or an entry point into a system, right? And if that system, and a good example that we just saw with with the Snowflake stuff, has important data on it, that becomes a real problem, right, from a criticality perspective. So this is just an example of where we help understand the external footprint, what the outside view looks like to an attacker, help prioritize critical risk based on vulnerability and the impact of that vulnerability. And when we talk about impact, we're really talking about what were we able to achieve. So if there was Log4Shell as a vulnerability, were we able to exploit it? Did that again give us a foothold? Did it give us access to anything important on that system? So the achievement is the real world impact, right? And being able to do that safely and being able to do that without doing anything destructive or impacting end systems or users is really powerful. But the idea is that it should be continuous. It shouldn't be a point in time. It shouldn't be like a one-off exercise. It should be something that you continue to validate. An important thing that that we hear from a lot of our customers, it's great that we can find stuff and say, from a sort of, let's say, a human perspective, we can identify problems, and somebody can come in and say, oh, by the way, you do need to update this application, or you do need to patch this server. You go and do that, and sometimes it's an exercise around network configuration and policies and processes, and you go and fix those. But then how do you then go back in and sort of test it again? So the idea is that you need to be able to continuously validate, have all of the changes that we've made to improve our environment, are they actually working? Are they helping, or are we in a worse situation? And now with the cloud being, being a flavor of what IT infrastructure looks like, things are changing all the time. So they are changing much more rapidly. So that sort of continuous testing becomes even more important.
Yes, Shaq, you're saying, I suppose the change hasn't changed, from on-prem to the cloud. And I think most customers I speak to are still in hybrid. But so actually you've got an increased attack surface, and some of the ways you were managing and looking after stuff on-prem, the challenges still apply in the cloud and across that kind of hybrid connection. But it's just getting visibility of all that. And being, it's kind of, you've got more to look after. I remember this happened with virtualization, right? There's loads more servers everywhere, right? But you've got more to look after across a sort of, I suppose, a larger remit. And then also the controls that you would have had don't actually work in the cloud as well as they do on-prem in the same way, right? So you need solutions that can help with this, right? Because I don't think anyone I speak to, there's normally not that many people doing the job anymore, right? In IT, the resources are tight, and this is where the automation and platforms like Pentera, that the validation that it offers, because you're doing stuff that you couldn't do manually from my perspective. But yeah,
absolutely. So the reason why we can sort of test continuously now, and we're able to get an idea of changing things in the environment, is the automation. Absolutely right. So the automation is a key element here. It's being able to extrapolate across large parts of the network. And like you said, the cloud has made it more complex. Hybrid environments, it means we have an unknown footprint attack surface. Sometimes we're talking about shadow IT, right? And again, in the cloud, there could be a lot of shadow stuff. And I also find that sometimes there can be a disconnect between the IT teams and the security teams, right? Or the developers, or people, let's say the cloud architects that are building stuff. But from a security perspective, there's no real visibility. And it may not be baked in to those processes as well. So, we talk about security by design. Sometimes that isn't there. And so IT teams or security teams really struggle to know, well, what have we actually got, and what does it look like? And so for us, the automation helps, right? You simply point it at your accounts, your network, your domains. We do all the work. We do the heavy lifting. We start to build up a picture of what's interesting on that network. Can we see anything critical? And it doesn't always have to be bad, right? We're not necessarily looking to sort of show anybody up, or or embarrass anybody. It's really about, I want to know, if I've got an organization that's working with customers and doing various things, I want to know if there's a problem there that we've introduced, not necessarily of our own doing. It could be an update, it could be a third-party vendor problem. I want to know as soon as possible, and so I can go and fix it. And I also want to know where I'm doing a good job, right? If there are certain things, processes that are working, the validation is also about showing you the good. It's not just about showing you the bad, showing, right, these things are working. Let's go and replicate that across other business units. Let's go and replicate that across the wider organization, because we know, in finance, we're doing a really good job in the build of our systems, or the cloud applications that we're running. So that's kind of looking at it from from the outside. And then what I do want to show is, what does it look like from the inside? And if I I can simply drag that over, so you should be able to see that. So this is looking at inside the network, right? So we've now got that sort of outside view from an attack surface perspective. On the inside, as some of my colleagues like to say, it's a bit like Swiss cheese, right? Once an attacker's in, that capability around lateral movement, and what I'll do actually is show this kind of view, which is always interesting when we look at it from an attack perspective. all of these different sort of techniques, if we talk about it from a MITRE ATT&CK perspective, represent different parts of the kill chain, represent different parts of your security controls, right? So when we talk about lateral movement on the right-hand side, we talk to a lot of customers that are in the process of looking at network segmentation, looking at, SD-WAN, all of that kind of stuff. Looking at, I guess, the bleeding edge of what are people doing in terms of managing their networks better. How do we make it harder for an attacker to move around network? Because going back to the example of the Snowflake I guess, breach, if we can call it that, is that with the demo account, it's suspected that the attackers initially got into a third-party contractor's environment and found a bunch of credentials, and they were able to do some sort of reconnaissance on Active Directory and target a lot of those contractors. So there was a third party initially involved. There was actually a partner, right, an elite partner of Snowflake. So they were like architects and experts in deploying the system, and so they had potentially access to a lot of different environments of users of Snowflake as well. We don't know, that those are kind of different stories that are going around at the moment. But usually, as soon as an attacker's into the network, and it may be through an endpoint, the first thing they're going to do is go for the crown jewels. And the crown jewels usually are credentials, because credentials then open doors for many other things. As soon as you get privileged access on a network, that's when the bad stuff happens. And then going back to I guess the hospitals in London, right? It's then, can we encrypt data? Can we do something that we can leverage and monetize, right? And ransomware is perhaps the most prolific version of that, right? It's been a money spinner for cyber criminals, and they are going to look for data that they can encrypt. Now, even within EDR solutions, and even within, I guess, any kind of security control at the endpoint layer, there are multiple layers within that sort of protection element, right? One is that initial payload that might run. There may be some sort of suspicious activity around file processes, right? Files being injected, even certain credentials being targeted. And what I'll do is I'll switch over to an example of that. And then eventually it gets to the last stage of that, which is encrypting the files, right? And so again, the EDR is tuned to potentially detect that encryption behavior as a last sort of stage to that. And so what Pentera can do is start to emulate a ransomware attack and say, well, what do all of the different stages of that attack look like? From that initial reconnaissance and discovery on the network all the way to exfiltration. And so, this is a good representation of that sort of story, really, of how we talk about, an attacker being on the network, looking for interesting, let's say, credentials, right? Because that's what they want, to be able to maneuver around the network, be able to target potentially Active Directory, look for high value accounts. In this case, this is I always use this example because it's a good example of a Kerber roasting attack. So it's an ASP rep roasting attack. In this case, we've got the Kerberos hash. We can start to see if we can decipher the plain text password for that attack. And eventually, we found a high value account that gives us RCE capability. We find interesting data, and again, from a platform perspective, we're not doing anything malicious, but we can prove that we can encrypt that data, carry out various stages of the ransomware attack. In this case, we're emulating Conti here on the right, and we show that we've completed the kill chain. And so that becomes really powerful in terms of visualizing what an attack looks like without actually doing anything malicious, right? Just going through the motions or emulation of the, a particular type of attack from start to finish helps you understand where the gaps are, right? If we're able to propagate this in production, it means, for example, and we see this all the time, somebody turned off the EDR on one server, right? So I like to call it shadow configuration or shadow, you can call it shadow IT. I think shadow configuration is that outlier, that one system where somebody decided one Friday afternoon to do a bit of testing and turn off the EDR. They did their testing, deployed whatever they needed to, and then they forgot to turn it back on. And then 6 months later, that same server gets ransomware, and you thought, what happened there? And so what happened is that, it's human error, right? We're all, from a human perspective, it's really hard to keep like you said, to scale up and to keep tabs on everything that's happening on the network. There are a lot of things that can break. It doesn't necessarily have to be a user, right? Applications, software systems are prone to break at some point. There could be updates, there could be services and policies that don't deploy properly. And I think from an operational perspective, those people who work in IT understand that problems happen, right? And it's all good, talking about that sort of utopia, are you using an EDR solution? Are you using a firewall, right? Tick, tick, tick. But in reality, we know that the validation exercise is just as important. We need to make sure that there isn't that needle in the haystack, right? That outlier, that shadow system that we forgot about. When I say forgot about, it's an interesting story. Is that time and time again we see deprecated servers, right? So let's say it's a 2012 Windows server that might be vulnerable to a number of things, right? There's a lot of interesting things you can start to do with older servers, and so they get decommissioned, they get turned off, and of course it's a virtual machine, and somebody one day goes in and turns it back on, and so unknown to anybody, there's a server sitting there that's vulnerable, that's perhaps got access to the crown jewels because it's got a whole bunch of credentials that are replicated, and unless you're constantly monitoring these things, right, they get forgotten about and left. And so that continuous validation becomes important. What does that attack surface look like today? And I want to be able to test that every day. Now, there's a lot more that we can do with this attack vector. We can start to look at mitigation and remediation. So we can start to say, well, what if I fix the root cause problem here? How does that disrupt the flow of the attack? How does it prevent the ransomware attack? And it does. I still have a problem with the EDR. I still have a problem with a weak credential for a service account. Still have a configuration issue and so on and so forth. But if I wasn't able to, for some reason, fix this problem, by the way, we provide all of that remediation. We provide detailed guidance through a wiki as well. But I can't fix that problem, perhaps, for some reason. But I can fix this weak password for a service account where we did the ASP rep roasting attack. And again, we can see that would prevent the attack. And eventually, we want to close down as many doors as possible. And we do want to fix the EDR, and we do want to fix that password. We want to fix the configuration around that account as well. Perhaps we want to fix some policies around SMB message signing, right? Just another example of another vulnerability that allowed us to further that kill chain. And so from a defense in depth approach, right, and that's what we all talk about in cybersecurity, if I've closed down as many doors as possible, I may not have closed every door, and it doesn't matter. Even if the EDR fails in the future, we know that we've prevented any kind of sensitive credentials or privileged credentials, i.e., going back to the snowflake idea.
What about my potholes? What about filling those in? As an analogy.
We've made it a lot smoother. Exactly, right? We smoothed that journey. So a few bumps doesn't really make a difference, right? It's the big gaping potholes that we want to fix first.
Yes.
Right. And so going to that analogy, we get a list of all of those potholes, right? And then a prioritization in how we fix them. Which ones do we fix first? Not necessarily based on severity, but based on impact, because we know these are the ones that potentially could give us a flat tire. And so we want to fix them.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you, Shakel. You supported my
analogy.
I love the context and the visualization. I think that's, just because these attacks are persistent, aren't they? They're not smash and grab. It's not like someone smashes your windows or your car and they steal your phone that you've left on the seat. This is, the attackers, and they're sneaky. They're going to be persistent. I mean, I remember hearing the story of this, I think the Sony Pictures hacks years ago, and this was, they're in there for a long time before that it was found out, and the full effects of that attack. And I'm showing my age, I think it's going way back, but I think it's just the way that your platform visualizes this stuff and gives that context is really powerful. And no one's got to sit there doing any kind of scripting to see this stuff, right? You're filling in a form, test this, there's the IP range. I mean, I run it, it's very easy to drive as well. So yeah, I really appreciate the kind of visualization aspect and this remediation priority that you're showing here. It's so powerful. And I think, yeah, I've not seen other methods that let you mark your homework and actually know what's going on, what's working. and giving you that validation that do it as well as Pentera. So I think it's a fantastic solution. But
Yeah,
be quiet now.
no, excellent. Yeah, perfect timing. So you're absolutely right. The intuitiveness of the platform is again what allows a lot of our customers to be up and running, within an hour or two. And so, and you've seen this as well, right? When we work with new customers for the first time, within half an hour they start driving and saying, well, this is easy. All I need to do is just point it at a subnet or an IP and let it run. You've got a little bit of networking knowledge around your network, and so you understand your own estate. Everybody understands their own estate from an IT perspective, and that's all you need to know. You point it at your network and let it run, and then sit back, right, and carry on with your day job, right? And that might be filling in potholes, and then you get back to the report at the end, and then you've got that cyber sort of resilience score of how did we do, right? Are there any things to fix? Like I said, right, it could be positive. It doesn't always have to be negative. It could be a validation that today we're actually doing a good job. And I see that quite a lot these days. I think a lot of organizations want to be able to sleep at night, especially from us, the cybersecurity team. They don't know, have we left something open? Have we forgotten something? And so this becomes a great validation exercise and say, actually, you're on the right track, right? But when something bad happens, equally, you want to know. And so the nature of us emulating attack also means that things like incident response and MDR services and alerts that might go into a SIEM or a SOC, all of those become something that you can measure as well. Because by nature, if that attack is triggering your EDR, you'd expect that alert to perhaps go into some sort of log collection, to be aggregated and correlated, and then eventually somebody to say, hey, by the way, looks like something bad's happening here. And like you said, the dwell time these days for ransomware can be quite short. And so, these things could happen within a matter of hours, and that window might be, I don't know, Saturday early hours or something. And you might miss it. So from a defense in depth approach, we do want to make sure that our security controls are stepping up and are working and are configured properly. And each update that happens, we want to make sure that they still work and they still do their job right. And that hopefully helps people sort of sleep at night. Now, just sort of a last bit that I want, unless you've got anything else to
No, that's fine. Yeah, I was just keeping an eye on time, so we've got to give some time for questions at the end here.
Yeah, I think just a couple of minutes on this, because I think this is really powerful, because it's now showing that sort of new world, of what we talk about. That continuous threat exposure means that we're no longer doing a point in time. So if we talk about, perhaps once a year, 2 weeks in the year in February, we run those tests, and we have to scope it in, we have to bring in a third party, and we need to then wait for the reports, because it's not instant, right? You're waiting maybe a couple of weeks or a day or two at the least, but there is a time frame between doing the testing and then getting the report, and then it's human led, right? It's very manual, so you're not guaranteed to get consistent results all the time. You're not necessarily going to cover everything across your network. But then in our world, what we talk about when we're operationalizing Pentera is, what does a whole year now look like? If we're talking about automation, if we're talking about very low touch, and being able to rotate it around different parts of the network, being able to rotate different types of tests. So, in the month of February, we could be doing a password strength assessment. So we do audit passwords and hygiene around Active Directory and credentials. Really important, right? Because that's one of the things that attackers do go after, most of the time. And then we do want to emulate a ransomware attack, perhaps at the end of February. And so we want to run a different type of test just to say, if how are things looking from an EDR perspective. And so you can rotate all of these different tests, and rotate it around different parts of the network, and sort of get that more holistic picture of what's working, what isn't working. And as you start to invest in new technology, and going back to that lateral movement piece, as you start to invest in perhaps a different way of looking at your network or network segmentation, you may then want to be able to say, well, how does that look like from a score perspective? Are we more resilient can Pentera now show us that we've got better resilience around lateral movement and potential attacks that are flowing? When we looked at the attack vector, the underlying reports that are produced, give you an overall score. And so what you're doing is, from a scorecard perspective, you're seeing, you're trying to sort of close down all those different gaps that we may have found initially. So I think that was just a powerful piece really about, what continuous threat exposure management should look like today.
Yeah, definitely. Because the network's not static, is it? Your infrastructure's not static. Your business is not static. Everything's changing. The threats are changing. So once a year is not enough, right? So yeah, I think that's a really great. I love this calendar view and operate. I can't even say it. Operate. You could say it actually, Shaq. Just that process. Yeah. Too long a word for me. Yeah. All right. So I think if you hand presenter back to me, I should be able to. We're going to wrap up with some questions now, and Katie's on. I don't know if Katie, we've been running long here. Yeah. So
I have been listening in the background. So thank you for that, both. That's really appreciated.
So
we do have three. We do. Yeah, we've got 3 questions that have come in. So I'm just going to fire through them. And you can both obviously just shout your answers back, see who wins. But first question is, what is the most prevalent threat factor in the UK at the moment? And what are/is the most effective migrations?
Prevalent threat factor.
It's kind of, two. So the prevalent threat factor in the UK, and then the most effective migrations for them.
I would say
mitigations. Yeah. I think it's mitigations.
I think it's quite topical in that we talked about credentials. I think we talk about phishing. Everybody is aware of, obviously phishing is one aspect of that, but that's a precursor to usually something like an info stealer. So a Trojan or malware then sits on your computer, sits in the background, starts collecting important information. So when we talk about an info stealer, they're usually designed to steal credentials for various different systems. So I think that the phishing is still phishing, and it's still
business email compromise, phishing. It's the things we've heard about. It could be even like weak VPN credentials, right? It's weak credentials, isn't it, Shaq? I think most of the attacks you hear about, it's kind of some kind of weakness in credentials gets the initial kind of foothold and entry point, and then we see this lateral movement, this escalation, privilege escalation from there. And I think, to my mind, it is stuff coming in via email is still a massive factor, right? And I think it's the fact that people don't have the visibility that some of those credentials are being lost as well, right? So it's we're still fighting that legacy. It's that technical debt, the legacy debt of all the systems you've had over the last. And it's all very well talking now about zero trust and identity as the new perimeter, but you've got 20 years of infrastructure to unpick, right? And this is where you need automation to do something about it. But yeah, I think the last part of that, was it mitigations or migrations?
Mitigation, sorry, effective mitigations.
Okay, sorry. Right. So I think, mitigating, I suppose it's the validation, isn't it, Shaq, in terms of credential assessment?
I think one is to sort of understand, like we do with Pentera, understand the attack surface, and then we'll automatically help you decide what mitigation steps you might need to take. And one of those, based on the fact that we're talking about credentials being stolen, is MFA. It goes back to MFA, right? So I think that's probably the best thing you could do today is look at your credentials. If you're using Pentera, you can test those credentials as well. You can hunt for those credentials, but more importantly, turn on MFA. For those important accounts, for those high value accounts, especially if you're an admin or global admin for important systems, you should have an MFA switched on. I think most people, IT security teams that I talk to, are switched on with that. In fact, funnily enough, it's mostly cybersecurity people that use password managers. Outside of that, nobody else seems to, there isn't a great uptake in terms of password management. But again, I think credentials being left in the wrong place as part of the snowflake, going back to the story, credentials being left somewhere that are easily accessible by an attacker is a real problem as well. So what we need to look at is, password vaults. Managing passwords better.
Okay. Our next one is around ransomware. So we've been asked, what are the repercussions of paying the ransom as a victim of ransomware?
That's a good one. So Shaq, I mean, we were talking about this, was it yesterday? I think you're talking about the Irish Health Service, the HSE, wasn't it? And yeah, that I remember that was a couple of years ago now.
I love this question every time it comes up. It's you know, and there's always a different answer. And you know, most people in cybersecurity will say, well, it depends, right? And I think, Michael, I think your answer was good, relating it back to the hospitals.
Yeah, sometimes I think it's easy to say don't pay, don't fund the kind of criminality of it, that the criminal business of it. But the problem is if it's critical infrastructure and there's people's welfare at risk, it might be that it's faster to pay. And I did hear of an insurance firm, cyber insurance firm, that was going. I think if you have one of their policies, and they'll go and they'll pay, they'll do the negotiation and pay if you had to, and then they'll try and go after the money. Right, so there are companies that go after, if people are paying by Bitcoin and things like that, there are companies that will follow, they'll follow the Bitcoin, the ledger, the blockchain, right, and go after and try and get the money back. So I think, the authorities and the people that are getting better at going after this, right? So, but it's an evolving landscape all the time, right? And so it's amazing, the whole industry of, nefarious industry, money laundering, all that stuff you've heard about and seen in the films, that all applies in cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
So there's ways of washing your bitcoins, and getting the money, right? So, and there's nation state actors doing this stuff, right? But it just moves so quickly, right? So I think it's very hard to say, well, don't pay, right? It depends on your business, what services you're offering, and basically it's human welfare first, right?
Yeah.
I think in the world of the defender, we've become a lot more sophisticated in negotiating with threat actors, and so there's a lot of people now that are experienced. And one of the I was at a conference recently, and we talked about proof of life. And proof of life is, have they actually got data that's important to us? What have they got? So one of the negotiating tactics around, well, show me what you've got, right? And if I can decrypt it, show me the decryption key so I can actually decrypt it. And so what they're looking at is now, one is that you can start to delay that process. You can obviously then start to get your organization back up and running and sort of understand what the damage is. But at the same time, you're looking at, well, is this legitimate, or have they got a bunch of documents that we don't really care about? They usually
that
do
kind of
stuff, but
your answer kind of does follow on to the last question, actually, which is quite relevant. Someone's asked, do you actually get the data and systems back, and are you more likely to then be targeted by the same criminal again?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes to both.
Yeah, you do. I mean, I think Colonial Pipeline was an example, wasn't it, Shaq, for that, the double extortion? Yeah. I'm sure that was in that story, and that was 2021 maybe, but yes, it's kind of like you don't want to be an easy target in this business, right?
No.
And once you're compromised,
I suppose if you pay once.
And also, well,
you're a good customer.
Depends if you know the true scope, right, of what was attacked, because it could be that there's a secondary payload, right? But Shaq, sorry, I talked over you.
No, sorry. I was talking over you as well. I was just sorry. I'm leaning into my microphone because it's over here, and I'm just realised leaning that way. So I think it's a good business model, right? If threat actors are giving you your data back, then they're now behaving as trustworthy. And so if they didn't give your data back, nobody would pay, right? They say, "Wow, you never paid them." Give your data back. So ironically, they have to be reliable to give your data back, and they're seen to be reliable, even though they took the data in the first place. But the problem is that these are affiliate programs, so it's just somebody now working on behalf of that particular group of cyber criminals or cyber gang, that particular type of ransomware family, and so they're going to share the details amongst their network and say, well, by the way, here's all of the data that we have on them. And when what we don't think about is all of the data that was exfiltrated and encrypted or whatever, they've got a copy of all of your data. So they might have a lot of leverage on you as an organization. They may have additional credentials, they may have additional sort of doors to get back in, and most of the time we hear that once organizations have paid, a few months later, a few weeks later, they get hit again, right? And it might be somebody within that particular affiliate program. It may be another another threat actor that's got some of the same details or the credentials that let the others in the first place, or follow on from that.